Hello and welcome to part 2 of Back to Life, the podcast where we share stories of recovery and creativity. I'm your host and my name is Milly Chowles. Thanks so much for joining me today, and before I introduce my guest this episode, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's listened to the first episode and taken the time to get in touch and share your thoughts with me. It's really lovely to hear, and to be completely honest with you, it was quite a scary prospect to release this podcast into the world. It's an idea I've had for a very long time, so it's really meant the world to have such lovely feedback from you guys. I really do appreciate it loads. And if you do have a chance to write a little review or give us a rating or both, that would be incredible. It really does make a huge difference to giving the podcast a little bit of kudos and making sure that other people who need to hear these conversations can find them. Anyway, so let's get to it. My guest this episode is another incredibly inspiring and unique individual who's taken just the hardest stuff that life's thrown at her and now uses exactly that to bring healing and joy to others. Her name is Lizzie Allan. She's a comedian, a transpersonal counsellor, a comedy therapist, and she's fostered a beautiful community around her work using stand-up comedy to help people turn their darkest experiences into comedy gold, which we're going to be hearing all about. She also founded the organisation Hilarapy, and there's a link in the show description to find out more about that. She's also recently done a brilliant TED Talk called Comedy Can Change the World If You Make Friends with Your Shame. Lizzie is currently living in Canada, but she's from the same small West Country town as me. And we actually went to the same school, but that's not really how our paths crossed. It's much stranger, weirder and darker than that. This one goes deep for both of us. So if you're sitting comfortably, let's roll the podcast. So Lizzie, we were at school together, we were in the same school, but that's not really how we met. We met when we both ended up in a psychiatric hospital in Bath, both very young. I was 20, I think you were 19. And yeah, we both were sectioned in a psychiatric hospital called Hillview Lodge.
Hillview Lodge, fun times.
Yeah, and that's really where our paths crossed. I don't think our paths particularly crossed before that point, but then we were landed in this very unusual sort of situation together. So yeah, do you want to tell me how you got there? I have some idea.
Sure, I'd love to tell you how I became sectioned under the Mental Health Act against my will. I was a bit of a lost teenager, and I didn't know what to do with my life. I struggled at school, and I thought, you know what, I am going to go travelling for a year, and when I come back, I'm going to definitely know what I need to do. I worked 3 jobs and saved up the money, and then jumped on a plane with a friend, and we went to India. And India hit me like a sledgehammer in the face, the poverty, the reality. But I fell in love with it eventually. I carried on to Singapore, then Thailand, and in Thailand I was really getting depressed. I was really going downhill, and I was just kind of going along with what other people were taking. I was smoking weed every day, and I was taking slimming pills, which is speed from the chemist. And on Thai New Year, I basically flipped through the veil into a parallel dimension and started, this sort of drug-induced psychosis episode. And, over the next few days, I didn't sleep. I had, constant messages about the existence of the planet. I could feel the entire world crying, all the suffering in the world. It was incredibly powerful yet crazy time. And I tried to call my mum over with the power of my mind. And everyone kind of just saw how unwell I was and how, strange my behavior was. And, I kept trying to sort of tell everyone, it's okay, my mum's coming and I'm still a child. I don't know what that part was. It was kind of my innocence, I guess. And then I ended up taking all my clothes off in a restaurant and doing a power war dance to protect energy and all. Also, it made sense at the time. You know, these things really do make sense when you're in a parallel dimension. It's hard to explain to the everyman. And so
I get it, Lizzie. I get it.
I know you would understand. You would understand. So many parallels, right? So many parallels. So then they grabbed me. A group of people grabbed me and put me in the back of a hot van and held me down, and I fought like an animal, and it was really scary. And they carried me into a hospital on the island. You know, it's Koh Phangan, it's a tiny little sort of health centre. Well. I know you do. And they tied me to a bed with T-shirts, and I was like, my mum's coming. I didn't understand what was going on. And then they injected me, and then I apparently was there for about a week. At one point, my friend, who was kind of sitting outside, she said, you must have got free off the bed, because she saw me whipping through the hospital, whipping through the thing, and then the nurses chasing me down. But I have no memory of that, which is a bit scary. My mum grabbed me. She came and picked me up, poor woman. And we had to go to a hospital in Bangkok for a week, and they really dosed me up with these crazy pills. And then we got, escorted home by 2 orderlies from, the hospital at great expense. And then I wouldn't calm down at home. I was like a caged animal. I think I was just kind of off on another planet. I was still in psychosis. I was getting loads of messages through. It was kind of quite crazy. And then, my doctor was called, and I think I showed him my breasts, actually. I was like, I'm still a child, as I lit it. And he was like, okay, I'm going to recommend she goes to the psychiatric ward. And so off I went. And then, of course, you and we began our real soul journey together, didn't we? Yeah.
I mean, I have very hazy memories of those times. My entrance to the hospital was not quite as not quite as exciting as yours in a way. It was like a lot darker.
It's very dramatic.
Yeah, it was very dramatic after a very serious suicide attempt. And but that wasn't actually why I got sectioned. I got sectioned because after making a very serious suicide attempt, which left me with my leg in a full cast and quite battered and broken, I managed to climb out the window the first day in the psychiatric hospital and go clubbing. And so when I got back, they were like, you're going to have to stay here and not go clubbing, so we're going to have to put a section on you. They're weird places, aren't they? Because they're kind of like holding spaces. You're not doing anything that's really helping you to get better other than taking some drugs.
It was a strange place. And at the time you could smoke, couldn't you? So they had that smoking room, and we just sat there all day long. And there was that woman, June, who was about, I don't know, she was like in her 70s, maybe 80s. And she had one leg, and I sat next to her. And I remember she was such a character. I really loved her. I said, oh, who are you? And she said, I'm June. I'm a baroness from Germany. And she had such a sort of she was so well spoken. And she looked at me across the room one day and she went, you there? How are you leaving? And I went, oh, in a taxi, probably. And she went, I'll go with you then. And I went, all right.
I remember her throwing an ashtray at my head when I walked in the door once. That's my only memory of June. I do remember exactly who you mean, but I remember her just picking up an ashtray, just launching it at my head. And yeah, that was how it could go. You didn't know. Unpredictable.
I thought I was going to be a famous rapper. I was under delusions of grandeur. I thought my rap album, True Say, was going to change the world.
Was this around the time of Hearsay?
Probably, yeah, I think so. It was just like the name just
Slightly
came
inspired.
to me, I mean, hearsay sounds like a rumour, but true say sounds, gospel, doesn't it?
The word of God. Yeah.
That's right. That's right, yeah.
I do actually remember you writing loads, and I do remember thinking, wow, you do have a real talent for writing. Sadly, I don't know if I remember hearing your rap album. Did it get written?
No, it didn't actually get written. No, I mean it's still in the works. I haven't taken it off the vision board. I just had this kind of feeling, or even like it was like a vision, like it already happened or was just about to happen. I was going to walk into a producer's office. He was going to say, Lizzie, I know you've got absolutely no musical experience or any, track record of any sort, but we're going to give you everything you need to write your album and produce it. That was just like the logical next step. I didn't even really question why I was in the psychiatric ward. I didn't really know why I was there or even think to ask. I mean, I was completely in another dimension. But I'll tell you, I did have that experience. I've just popped this in here. I did have this experience of walking down the hall and then suddenly kind of feeling this overwhelming love coming out of me and filling the space. And my mind just went, "You're Jesus reincarnated." And of course, I just believed what my mind said. But, it wasn't true. I'm not Jesus reincarnated. And I don't wear Birkenstocks. That's pretty much how I know. But that rapping career, that was pervasive. I felt that for the whole time I was there. And I was there for about 6 to 8 weeks, I think.
I think the kind of way that you were mad sounds like more enjoyable than the way that I was mad. I was mad in a very self-destructive, neurotic way. Feeling I was Jesus would have been great, actually, at that time. I felt like the opposite, I suppose. But yeah, so that's where our paths crossed. And then I guess we went on our merry ways, but we remained friends on social media. And then many years later, I saw you post a video, which was your graduation performance after doing your comedy degree. And there was a bit in there where you were talking about being in the hospital, about your psychotic episode, about being sectioned. The piece was called Sectioned. And in it, you talked about meeting another patient on the ward who had weed but wouldn't give it to you. And I thought, I think that's me. Do you remember that incident?
I do. I remember it. It was a pivotal moment in my getting day release from the psychiatric ward, because I was sort of rapping in everyone's faces. If the doctor sort of wanted to do an assessment on me, I would rap in his face and he would just up my dosage, which just really wasn't helping me at all because I was smoking weed on top of it. And my friend was bringing a little bit of weed in for me now and again, and I was letting him eat my hospital food in return. And one day I didn't have any, and you were known about the ward too. To be quite to always have your stock in, So I came over and I asked you. I said, "Hey Milly, can I just have a smoke, or borrow a smoke, or buy a smoke?" And you were like, "No." And I was like, "Oh, please, please." I was like that annoying kid sister. I was like, "Please, please." And you went, "No." And I went, "Why not?" And you went, "Because you'll talk too much." And I said, I promise I won't talk. And then I was really manipulative because I started to raise my voice. I said, "I promise if you give me a smoke." And you were just like, all right. And that was awful of me thinking about it. But, you got to do what you got to do when you're in hospital, don't you? Or when you need your
I
drugs.
understand. Yeah, you definitely do what you got to do. I do remember being scared that you would go into an even deeper psychosis. I mean, you're already, as you say, pretty psychotic. And I just thought, if I give you the spliff that sends you over the edge, then that will be bad. But it sounds like I was quite harsh as well. So sorry for that.
No, I don't think it... No, I think it's fairly sensible that you were making that assessment at the time. Fairly sensible. But what you did do is you said to me, "No, you'll talk too much." And then I realised, I just thought, I can do that. I can smoke a spliff and not say anything. So I just stopped saying anything in earshot of anyone with a clipboard. And within a couple of days, they had kind of made the assessment that I was well enough to leave the hospital. But you see, the funny thing is, nothing changed in my head. I was still completely, I don't know, like walking on air or something. I have no idea. And I really believe the drugs that they were giving me were really keeping me high. They were keeping me in that place. And they let me out after that. And then I started to kind of get more access to alcohol and other things. And I would just go out and I'd be meeting up with friends and then end up kind of tripping because the strength of the medication I was on, coupled with a drink, even just a bit of alcohol, I was tripping. It was horrible. I'd be holding on to the earth and my friends would be like, "Oh gosh, we better send her back." It was really horrible, really, and highly embarrassing, after the fact, when I got well, I was really ashamed.
How long did it take you to get well, to kind of come back to reality as such?
It was really overnight. It was absolutely bizarre. They'd basically said, you can go if you want. But my mum wouldn't let me come home because she just said I was completely mad, and I had a brother and sister who were just infants. And then when my grandpa died, my mum went, you can come home. And we went off to Scotland to this funeral, and I had all this medication. I just said to my mum, I'm not going to take these drugs anymore. And I woke up in the morning and I was back in this planet, if you know what I mean. Like, I'd been in another place for so long, believing that I was completely limitless, that my power was just unstoppable. My love and my purpose and everything was unstoppable. And suddenly I was just nobody. And the first thing I woke up and I thought was, oh no, I'm not going to be a famous rapper. And then the second thing that came just a moment after was, oh shit, I told everyone I was going to be a famous rapper. You know, that kind of thing. You're like, oh no. And that was it. Then I was like, I couldn't see anyone. I isolated. I cut everyone off. I was depressed. I couldn't get out of bed. Then began the next chapter of my healing. But I was definitely back in what we might call this 3D reality. And it was very boring in comparison. I will say that for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, I've certainly had that kind of, and I think most people can relate to that, waking up after a night out and having a bit of a cringe. Oh, what did I say? But to wake up from a sort of 3-month psychotic episode, that cringe must have been quite phenomenal.
Oh, it was horrendous. It was so shameful. You know, the stigma that's surrounding mental illness. You know, I know today, 21 years later, I know today that what that was for me was a huge gift. It was a spiritual awakening. I had access to information. Yes, it was the dark night of my soul, but it was also, I can't really explain it, but today it's a gift. And back then it wasn't. It was, what's wrong with me that I would go so off-piste and the person next to me can take 100 times more drugs than I've taken and not even blink. And there's me like taking my clothes off in public, doing energy war dances. They weren't war dances, they were like energy kind of, I was protecting. Oh, it was just crazy. Like, I don't know, but yeah, incredibly shameful. It took a long time to unwind that. And when I got to doing that show that you were referencing, where I did that show at university, that was on the back of a research project about using comedy as a therapeutic tool to shine a light on my own self-stigma and shame. And I was already kind of 4 or 5 years into recovery by that point. So I had done a lot of work on, therapeutic work on that. And so that changed everything for me, that show, because I had to be with my shame a lot. I had to be with my shame to write it. I had to be with my shame to share it. And actually what it was incredibly cathartic, but it helped other people. And I didn't realise it would have that effect. A classmate came up to me at the end of the show and she said, I have bipolar and I never tell anyone. And I'd known her for 3 years, So it was crazy. And then a psychiatrist who worked at Hillview Lodge saw it on YouTube and requested that I come and do a performance to educate staff and bring hope to service users at their mental health awareness day or something. And they paid me to do it. And then that snowballed and people kept asking me to perform it. And the response was kind of like, oh, so performing my story from a place of wellness, also infusing it with comedy, was a tool for change. And very quickly I thought, well, I'll start teaching other people how to do this, and that was kind of the birth of what I do now, which is comedy therapy.
It's so incredible. I think that comedy is such an amazing vehicle. I think it connects people in a way not many other mediums do. And also, like you say, you can really deliver those serious, hard-hitting, difficult messages in a way that doesn't feel preachy or off-putting or lectury or cringy. So tell me how kind of you got from the psychiatric hospital to doing that degree. What was the start point for you with your recovery journey?
I knew probably about, my dad was in recovery from drugs and alcohol. My mum had left him when I was 2. And so I knew that you could live happily without drink and drugs. So I had a father in recovery, and that was like a sort of seed that was planted very early on. You know, I started working as a care worker after looking after June with one leg in the hospital. I used to run around getting her cups of tea. And my mum said, oh, you should be a care worker. So I started doing care work. But at the same time, I was working in a nightclub and all my friends were doing drugs. And I just kind of got pulled into it. But my mental health was so bad because of what had happened and how far I had gone, that whenever I kind of took drugs, it really, really scared me, because I thought I was going to go mad again. And I certainly didn't want to go mad again. It was kind of a place you don't really want to go back to once you've come back from there. I don't regret it, but yeah. So by the age of 21, I knew I needed to be abstinent, but I didn't know how. And I just started doing geographicals. I moved away from everyone who was doing drugs, and I moved to a new city. I moved closer to my dad, actually, down in Devon, and I began again there, but I couldn't let go of weed, and weed was still so bad for my mental health. But I managed to not do coke anymore, or any of the other stuff that was going around. I just went along with it. You felt like always, so I wanted connection, right? I really wanted to belong, and I was really struggling with my sexuality. I hadn't come out to myself. It was just really painful to be in such self-rejection. And so I kind of carried on with my life, and I started to do really well. I became a youth worker. Then I started working for the youth offending team. Then I was working for intervention, and I joined a choir, and I did some hip hop dancing. But I would always spin back round to being on my own, smoking dope in my bedroom, and feeling like I was, losing the plot. And I started I started to have relationships with women that, of course, I couldn't show up in. I couldn't be myself in these relationships. So, they crashed and burned, and that was incredibly painful. And I kept reliving, rejection and abandonment. But really, the truth was, as I was rejecting and abandoning myself every single time. And eventually I was sort of like, I'd been living in Manchester for 11 months, and I'd been like completely off my head, back on the party scene, moved in with people who were partying every other night, and I just couldn't deal with it. I was like, I have to go and do some voluntary work. So I went off to Morocco and to go and work with children, right? But I was really unwell, and it was like, on the way over, I was reading the book, and it was like, Morocco supplies 42% of the world's hashish. And I thought, okay, there's a sort of, subconscious choice there. And within a week, I had scored really strong weed, and I got myself into a right emotional spin down, and I was there for 2 months, just going like horrendously into depression and paranoia, and just awful. I didn't know what I was doing, and I came home and I exploded on my family. I didn't know how to cry. I didn't know how to talk about my feelings. I didn't know how to connect. I just was just so lost. And my dad called me up and he said, "Are you ready?" and I said, "Yeah, I'm ready. I want to change. I want to stop using drugs." And he said, "Well, come to this." And it was a Narcotics Anonymous camp out in Penzance, and I went with him, and I heard the message for the first time. I'd been to meetings before. I'd been around it my whole life, but for the first time, I realised it was the therapeutic value of one addict helping another staying clean, and it changed my life, right? So within 3 months, I was actually completely abstinent, and that was 11 years ago.
Wow, amazing that when you talk about that self-rejection and the pain of self-rejection and self-abandonment, I mean, that resonates so deeply. I really kind of felt that, because that's where I was in my life for so long. And it's, now, I used to say that my biggest fear was rejection, and that I would do anything to avoid rejection. But like you say, I rejected myself every single day. And that's a horrible, horrible way to live. So you got into recovery and you stayed in recovery. How did you go from what you were doing with sort of youth offending and youth work and all that work that you were doing to comedy?
Well, I'd got all that experience, and then I got into recovery, and I'd moved back to Bath, and was getting well. And after a couple of years, all these kind of older, wiser women were saying to me, you need to go and get some education, right? What are you going to do with your life? I'd really struggled with school, and I can't go back to school, but I did. I found a comedy writing and performance degree. It just came and it popped up, and it was the first one they'd ever run, and it was up in Manchester. And I love comedy. Humour was such a relief for me when I was growing up in our family, because it was such a challenging time growing up. My mum and dad had broken up. My mum was really struggling with the trauma of her past, and she smoked dope daily. And my dad was struggling, and he'd been through abuse at boarding school. And so, as children, it was really kind of scary, but it was the laughter that really made me feel safe. And it really made me feel like, well, when everyone's laughing, it's all right. Isn't it all right when everyone's laughing? And it kind of became my go-to. I became the clown, I became the one that always wanted to make people laugh, because when the room was laughing, I was safe. Unfortunately, for a long time, I kind of just thought that's all I'm good for, so I didn't know how to cry. I didn't know how to be vulnerable, like I was saying a bit earlier about that stuff. So I'd kind of started that journey in recovery, and then I went to university, and then I did a research project as my final piece for uni, and I wanted to see if I could use comedy as a therapeutic tool to shine a light on my self-stigma and shame, because I was so ashamed still. I carried a lot of shame. And
it sounds like really pioneering to me. I mean, you're the first person I've heard of doing this. Is this something that you learned from somewhere else, or was this your idea?
I feel like I've really stumbled into this role, and yeah, it was a funny one actually, because I didn't know what to do comedy about, and I'd broken up out of this sort of really horrendous relationship, very kind of toxic relationship, and I just didn't know what to write comedy about. And I met up with this amazing comedian, and he said, just write about what you know. Like, what have you done that's funny? And I went, well, I thought I was Jesus reincarnated once. I guess that's pretty funny. And he was like, yeah, write about that. And so I had to do a research project, and my tutor was like, well, what's your question, right? And she kind of almost had to spoon feed it to me, because I was like, I don't know. And she was like, well, what about the therapeutic value? And I was like, okay, yeah, that's my question. Like, not that she could even give it to me, but she sort of did. And luckily. So I began researching comedy therapists. Who's doing comedy? Who's using comedy as a tool to help people? Because you've got drama therapy, art therapy, those are the big hitters, right? But who's doing comedy therapy? And it's actually a budding thing that's growing. And through my journey to where I am today, I believe I'm the only person who's building a community around it.
So I've been offered, I've done art therapy and drama therapy and pretty much all the therapies, but I've never been offered comedy therapy. I would have loved to have done comedy therapy. I think it sounds brilliant, and I can absolutely see how that works. I mean, I often have thought it myself. I'm in 12-step recovery as well, so we go to meetings, and meetings are they're just rich places of stories, aren't they? And people, human experiences, and people from all walks of life. And there is huge comedic value in so much, and there's so much humour amongst us there. I think that often kind of surprises people, how much sort of dark humour addicts have. There is so much humour in there. There has to be, doesn't there, really?
I absolutely agree, because I mean, I've come to the point where I see that the light and the dark belong together. We all have light in us, and we all have dark in us, and we live in duality, and we have to balance it. That's the kind of tightrope we walk with good mental health. And whether you're somebody who identifies as having mental health issues or difficulties or not, everyone struggles with mental health issues. It's just the nature of being alive. And bringing that humour in. I tell you what it is, a punchline provides release from tension, just like healing brings relief from pain. So when you're telling these huge stories, these big, heavy stories, when you can make or bring a piece of laughter or a moment of joyous merriment into the whole kind of experience, it means that we can kind of sigh, like we get that kind of break from the heaviness, and we're telling these stories from a place of wellness. So why can't we have a laugh about it, as long as we're not belittling our experiences or trying to kind of cover or mask it with humor. I think it's really healthy.
I mean, yeah, there's definitely a lot of humour. I was watching one of your sketches that you sent me, or one of your performances, and you were talking about planning your own funeral, and it's just an absolute classic, isn't it? I mean, meet an addict who hasn't planned their own funeral in a very sort of self-centred and morbid way. I mean, it's definitely a big preoccupation of mine, like, God, would anyone actually be at my funeral? What would they say? Oh, she had so much promise and so much talent. And then they'd maybe find a notebook of mine with like crack-addled scribblings in and go, my God, she could have been the next Sylvia Plath. And that's kind of how I imagined it. But I don't know if that would have happened. But yeah, I mean, you did a brilliant sketch about it. I was lolling hard, actually. And I think that's such a relatable thing. You also said, you've used humour to process and deal with some really heavy subjects in life as well, including grief and death of a member of your family. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that show came off the back of some therapeutic comedy that I used. I used my own my own preachings to do it. And I'd been over in England because I live in Canada now, and my cousin died like from a farming accident, and it was so sudden and it was like horrible and horrific. And then within kind of I was still there, and we went to the funeral a week or two later, and at that time all my family were drinking and everybody was drunk and or taking drugs of some sort, and I was incredibly lonely and heartbroken, and it was really, really tough to be in that environment. And went to his funeral. He had like 1,000 people at his funeral. He's a really popular young farmer, and I kind of went home really heartbroken, and I came back and I just had to process it. So I started to do my stream of consciousness writing, and out came all the kind of anger and the sort of like upset and the blame, and it all came out. And then I got these light bulbs of absurd humor within it. Like, it was a point where I was sitting in the funeral in the service, they were doing this slideshow of him, and every single photo he was drunk, right? And they were like, oh, here's Todd, he always fell asleep, there's one of him asleep in the pub, he'd always fall asleep in the pub. And then and they just thought it was hilarious that this guy was an alcoholic. And I was like, oh, that's really sad. And then I just thought, well, you'd never do that at a heroin addict's funeral, would you? So that was just like this simile that came out of that, whereas I just thought, imagine doing that at a heroin addict's funeral. You'd be like, oh, here's one of Mike. He's gouging out on the sofa again. Look, he's got a needle hanging out of his arm. Or, oh, here's another one. He fell asleep behind the bins. We had to, that kind of crazy shit. And then another thought, I thought at one point, like, I wonder if I'll get this many people at my funeral, And it's like, what room is there in your head at a funeral to have those kind of egoic thoughts about how popular you might be when it's your time to leave this mortal coil? Yeah, so I mean, it was a way of kind of processing that. And then when I did that show, it was profound actually, because a man came up to me after the show and thanked me, and he said, my mum died 2 weeks ago, and that really helped me to process her passing. So that was what, and I've also used it to, like I was saying, I was very ashamed of my sexuality. And more recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, I did a one-woman show about getting pregnant the gay way. Again, I used therapeutic comedy to kind of show up on stage and talk about my internalized homophobia. And it was a profound experience. After that show, I have changed. I've absolutely changed. And as well as it being quite kind of serious, I brought some drama into it. It was also so funny. So I'm not blowing my own horn. I'm just, it was funny. Like, I thought it was funny. So, I was really glad to kind of marry the two and be able to kind of educate people about what goes on inside us.
Amazing. I think shame and stigma to me are such huge challenges that we have to overcome societally, but first of all, personally. And I know that for myself, it's still an ongoing process. I still have a lot of shame around my addiction and the places that my addiction took me to. And every time I do anything public facing, even slightly, whether that is, a Facebook post or a radio report or whatever, it still feels like I have to kind of brace myself, and go, no, this is all right. This is safe to do. You can do this. Because I still feel shame. I still feel sort of slightly dirty about the fact that I'm an addict. How has that been for you? Do you feel that still, or has that gone?
I don't feel shame around being an addict anymore. And I don't hold self-stigma anymore about it. But I can't change the stigma out there. Not by force anyway. I mean, we do it one story at a time. But I think what comedy does, and storytelling in general, is that we get to own, without the need for sympathy or approval, our human experience. Comedy connects people with their empathy, and it pulls down the barriers that separate us. Humour encourages us to be forgiving and open-minded, whether our stories are the same or not. And there's so much of it that is, a bit silly, and that's okay too. But within it, I'm sharing my truth. And if you're in the audience and you're somebody who doesn't share their truth, because shame keeps us in the dark. It needs to be in secret. Bringing a light, which is what we do with a comedy or telling our story in general, brings a light to that dark place where shame hides. And, and people hear our stories and they go, well, I didn't think of an addict as somebody who is like you. I get that all the time, or not all the time, but I've had that in the past. Like, you don't look like an addict, or you don't sound like an addict. And it's like, everybody is an addict. Everybody's trying to escape something.
Yeah, but also when we've been in recovery for a time, we do recover. When I think back to how I was during my using, and how I am now, the two are almost like two different beings. And sometimes it's hard for me to even connect that I was that person. What I love about your comedy, basically, is that it puts you in the hero role as well. You're so empowered in that role. If you're tackling difficult issues from your own past, you're not someone to be sympathised with. You are, as you say, it's about empathy, but you're very much in the driving seat. And there's huge power, isn't there, in making an audience laugh? I think that must just be the biggest buzz ever. Is it anywhere close to the Jesus moment that you had?
Oh, the Jesus moment. I mean, that's above and beyond, isn't it? But that experience that I had back in the hospital, where I did experience that kind of flow of consciousness and love and felt my connection, that is something that I've actually been taking the slow road with, instead of trying to get there through drugs and find that connection that way. It comes slowly through heartfelt connections with other people, my meditation, my praying, my growth, my emotional growth, and my service on this planet, to make the world a better place. It started off with comedy and telling my story, and then I really was fascinated with the therapeutic aspect, and so I retrained as a therapist, and I went a whole level deeper on my own recovery, on my own healing from the family trauma. And, and I was able to really smash through some of those really negative beliefs that I was holding even in recovery. Like, I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable. I mean, they were deep inside, but, they were impacting my relationships. And I was able to kind of work through that, and then bringing that into the work that I did with my students changed everything and brought it to a whole other level. I don't know, there's something so profound when somebody finally kind of opens up and cries and says, I don't think it's all right to be me. And then they see in connection with other people that they're loved right where they're at. And then they go on to do comedy. And that's just like phenomenal, that experience.
I mean, I said it was, it must be like a real kind of feeling of power to be on stage and making people laugh. But I also think it must be the most terrifying and vulnerable place to be, because, I mean, there's one thing kind of getting up there and sharing your story, but then there's also getting up there, you're sharing some of your story, but you're also needing people to laugh, at least in some of the right places. That must be quite terrifying for people you work with. Do they perform in public?
It is terrifying. It's horrible. Like, I don't recommend it. Nobody do comedy. But that's kind of how I felt when I was out there in the comedy scene. I hated it because I just felt like if I go out there, people just need me to be funny. And if I'm not funny, they'll reject me. And I just bombed, I bombed because I didn't get behind my own stuff. And I didn't kind of understand why I would go out there and make jokes about being in the psychiatric ward when people were kind of walking in front of the stage, sloshing their beer jugs and, and not really listening. And I thought, why would I do that? I just felt like absolutely insane. So I had to move it into a different arena, and that made it safe and healthy. And so we always do alcohol-free comedy shows, but everybody knows who's coming to the show as an audience member, what we do. And when I MC from the front, I let everyone know that they're basically in a therapy session, that they are getting therapy as much as the person on the stage. And that changes everything, you see. If it's your house party, you can make the rules. And that's kind of what I needed to do. And so you see people absolutely take off.
So what's the vision for you now? I know that you're working on some really exciting things at the moment, and you've got a new space. Tell me what the future holds for Hilarapy.
We have a comedy studio, like a TV studio. Hilarapy Studios is opening up. It's just a kind of a brand new comedy ecosystem. I mean, world domination is the vision. Being a lighthouse, having this kind of work available to anyone, anywhere. We've got an online program which has COVID has given us that gift. All my stuff was outward facing, and COVID brought us online, which has changed everything, because now we have people joining us from all over the world, which just blows my tiny mind. So I'm constantly learning with this. It's a unfolding journey, and I'm beating a new path. And so I often, I trip and stumble and I make mistakes, but I have a great team, and I have a wonderful community of amazing creatives all over the world, and being part of this, and just sharing our light and shining a light and on the human experience, and saying, hey, it is okay to be human.
Yes, exactly that. Thank you so much to Lizzie for sharing her incredible story and for all the work she's doing to bring light to the world. I found that conversation so nourishing and uplifting. I hope you got something from it too. There are links to her organisation Hilarapy and her recent TED Talk in the description. If you want to keep updated with the podcast, please hit follow or subscribe. And if you've got a second to pop a little review or rating in there as well, that really does make a big difference. The music you can hear is composed by Double O, and the incredible artwork you can see over on our Instagram page at Back to Life Pod is by Georgie Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us. Take good care. Bye.